a seat.
Ready, Billy? Well, thank you all for coming.
Hello.
This is a presentation that means a lot to me. It's something that I've been studying quite a while. So we're going to be talking about painting and experience in 15th century Italy. And what I mean by experience is the relationship that the people of that time, the artists, the people who paid for the artwork, as well as the common person, what their experience with the paintings. So with that in mind, we're going to look at the beginning of the presentation at the early Renaissance and the relationship that people had with the artist in the creation of the artwork. And then we'll look at the period I, and that's what I was talking about when I mentioned the person's relationship to the artwork. Because I think you'll notice by the end of the presentation that the average 15th century Italian saw the paintings in a way that we can't see them. And then finally, with the advent of humanism, we're going to go from Byzantium through the early Renaissance right to the door of the High Renaissance. But to begin, I'd like to take you to ancient Greece for a minute and look at the statuary of ancient Greece. The ideal for ancient Greece, or the aim, was to create ideal beauty. I think we probably all have heard in our time in the school that the Greeks valued that. They considered that a gift from God, or from the gods, and they considered physical beauty a gift to the gods. During celebrations, beautiful people would be used. And then when we go to ancient Rome, portraiture was very important. Rome was not as ethereal as ancient Greece. Rome was much more rooted in the earth, and the person, the human being, came out in the Roman sculpture and painting much more than the ancient Greek. So what we're going to do next then is we're going to go through Byzantium, and we're going to see that in Byzantine time they lost that ability to create realism. And there were a couple of reasons. One, we'll actually start with B, idolatry. The Catholic Church, in its ever strong desire to control people, was very much afraid of people taking iconography the wrong way. And they felt that the simple person wouldn't know the difference between a realistic portrait and the real divinity that's being painted. So the simple person would pray to the portrait, or pray to the figurative painting. And the other thing is that where ancient Greece was going after ideal beauty, ancient Rome was going after the real person. During Byzantium, we're in the Roman Catholic Church now, the spiritual aspect of the painting was very important. So we will see how the artist would express the spiritual in the artwork. So you're going to notice, as I said, that there isn't the type of realism that we had. What we're looking at here is the Madonna with an emotional expression. We can see gold in the painting, which is something that you use to express the divinity that's being painted. And also you see blue. I don't know if you're aware of the reason why we relate the Madonna in blue all the time, but the artist would be told in the contract what materials to use back then. The hand of the artist wasn't the most important aspect of the contract. We will read a contract in a moment. But the materials being used was just as valuable as the hand of the artist. So gold was a very expensive material, and The blue is ultramarine blue. Ultramarine blue translates to blue from across the ocean because it comes from lapis lazuli. And it was purchased in Afghanistan. So it was a very expensive mineral that was used for the creation of the paintings. So in the contracts, the patron would tell the artist, I want this much gold, and I want it here and here, and I want this quality of gold, and I want this much ultramarine blue. And we knew that the most important figure in the painting, which is very often the Madonna, would get the ultramarine blue, because then the person looking at the painting recognizes that this is the person being celebrated in the painting. It's not only the illiterate that would believe that the painting has the divinity in it. We're going to read, Robert's going to read right now, about a pope that also was frightened into thinking that St. Anthony, which this is St. Anthony here, that we better respect him in this painting or else we're in trouble. Okay.
Pope Boniface VIII had the old and ruinous Basilica of St. John Lateran at Rome rebuilt and redecorated with much care and expense, and he listed by name which saints were to be depicted in it. The painters of the Order of Minor Friars were preeminent in this art, and there were two particularly good masters from this order. When these two had painted up all the saints the Pope had ordered, on their own initiative they added in a blank space pictures of St. Francis and St. Anthony. When the Pope heard about this, he was angered by their disrespect of his orders. I can tolerate the St. Francis, he said, as it is now done, but I insist on the St. Anthony being removed completely. However, all the people sent by the Pope to carry out this command were thrown down to the ground, fiercely knocked about, and driven away by a terrible, resounding, gigantic spirit. When the Pope heard of this, he said, let St. Anthony alone. We can see he wants to stay. In conflict with him, we can only lose more than we gain.
So, this is the St. Anthony. There were a series of these paintings in this particular church. I couldn't find online a picture of the St. Francis. There seem to be 3 or 4 of these series in that church. So we're going to look at humanism now. And humanism, the paintings were still spiritual, but the humanist thought started to explore science and explore philosophy in a way that was a threat to the church. What we're going to start to see now in these paintings is how humanism and the study of science and the human being started to bring us from the Byzantine style of painting through the early Renaissance, and as I said, right to the doorway of the High Renaissance. First thing, I mentioned up here at the top, the artist was seen like an illustrator today. So if we think about an artist today, in the 21st century, and actually since the Impressionists, the artist paints what he or she is passionate about, brings it to an art gallery, and if you buy it, great. If you don't, then that's fine. This is what I wanted to do. However, in the Renaissance, it was the patron who made the decision what was going to be painted. It was the patron that decided how big the painting was going to be, whether it was an altarpiece or whether it was a part of the church wall. And it was the patron that would decide what is to be painted. Okay. And as I said earlier, the materials were also decided in the contract. I mentioned ultramarine blue, I mentioned gold. The importance of the master's hand was there, but it wasn't as important as in Leonardo's day. In Leonardo's day, if he was hired to do a painting and the patron found out that his studio did the whole painting, there would have been a problem. But at this time, the masters weren't as skilled as the high Renaissance masters, which is why the materials in the paintings, and sometimes the frame, was more expensive than the actual painting. Yes, okay. So this is a contract. Would somebody like to read the contract? It's a contract with Ghirlandaio. One thing I want to say, though, I don't know if it's said here, the person who commissioned him did not write this. This was written by a third party who was going to be the judge as to whether the contract was fulfilled. John, would you mind reading it?
Well, we need to get a little closer.
Okay.
This day, 23 October 1485, the said Francesco commits and entrusts to the said Domenico the painting of a panel. Domenico is to color and paint the said panel with his own hand in the manner shown in a drawing on paper with those figures, and in that manner shown in it, not departing from the manner and composition of the said drawing. He must color the panel at his own expense with good colors and with powdered gold on such ornaments that demand it. The blue must be ultramarine of the value about 4 florins per ounce. He must deliver the said panel within 30 months of today. He must receive as price for the panel 115 large florins if it seems to me that it is worth it. I can go to whoever I think best for an opinion on its value and workmanship. If it does not seem to me worth the stated price, he shall receive as much less as I, Fra Bernardo, think right. If Domenico has not delivered the panel within the above said period of time, he will be liable to a penalty of 15 large florins.
Yes, so, as I said, the person who's saying, if I deem it's worth it, he's not the patron. He's the arbiter making the decision for both. And during this period of time, the artist did have the ability to fight back. And they would go to the guild, and another artist would judge it and say, it's worth it. He followed through on the contract as best as could be expected. Renaissance theater and the Mass. So remember, these are pieces of artwork being created to educate the illiterate masses who couldn't read the Bible and couldn't understand the Latin Mass on Bible stories. It was, again, the way the Catholic Church would bring people under its power, basically. So people did go to theater, and they did go to Mass. The priest, during the Mass, would use certain postures and certain hand movements, which we will look at, in the same way that Renaissance actors would do it. So people were able to understand what was happening in Mass because they knew the visuals much better than we do, based on what they had lived through. One thing that I thought was very interesting here, Leonardo suggested 2 sources for a painter to draw upon for gestures, and one was orators and one was the mute, which makes perfect sense. The orator would be educated in conveying a message verbally with proper inflections as well as posture, and the mute would rely on that. So I have 4 different versions here of things that people had understood. So here, the Benedictine order, they had actually created a list of hundreds of different postures and hand motions. But the author of the book that I took this part of the story, of the presentation from, he had about 6 or 7 of them. One is demonstration. A thing that has been seen may be noted by an opening of the palm of the hand in its direction. This is Fra Angelico in the coronation. So something being seen, meaning Mary being coronated, they're showing us that this is what that we need to be looking at. We have another one here. This is interesting because we have the angel Gabriel and Mary during the Annunciation. Both of them are showing respect to the other person. He's got his palm to her, she's got her palm to him. And the way I understand it from the book that I took this from, on the altar in church, when the priest was talking about Jesus or talking about the crucifixion, his hand would be pointing in that direction. Again, we've got to remember that the people in the congregation didn't all understand Latin. So they needed to have visuals just to know what was happening in church. And obviously, when you go every week, then the visuals start to make more and more sense. This is a little bit later than where we are right now, but I wanted to show grief and shame. So grief was expressed as pressing the breast with the palm of the hand, and shame covering the eyes with the fingers. One thing that I didn't know until I started to work on this presentation is the Medici Venus was the inspiration for Eve. And she's the Venus that's showing how, what would the word be, shy in a way, in a very respectful way. So style and technique in Byzantium. So I already mentioned about the use of materials. One thing that we're going to notice as we go through the paintings is the ability to create the full three-dimensional figure was not strong during Byzantium. Again, it wasn't the aim. Expressing the spiritual was the aim. But we will go through and we will see how that does come back. But the first thing that, well, let's look at the next one here. We still, I just wanted to remind you about the stylization and the 2 different materials that are being used over here. And now we have the first master that we'll be looking at. This is the Byzantine painting that we looked at earlier. This is Duccio from Siena. And if you look at Duccio, first of all, this is ultramarine blue, but one of the aspects of ultramarine blue, depending on what it's being painted on, it could turn black. So this was originally ultramarine blue. We do see it over here. She's very flat. The angels don't have a real physical space. They're kind of kneeling on clouds. The ability to create space wasn't there yet. And as I said earlier, the ability to show real physical form wasn't there yet either. So what we do have is 6 angels with the Madonna. She's sitting on a throne. And we will see how when we get to Giotto that the perspective of the throne starts to become real. We start to see that a person can actually be sitting on this throne. And I just want to look at one more Duccio. Another thing to look at, again, the spirit, the person, the divinity is the most important part of the painting. We do have him in ultramarine blue. We do have gold. The architecture here is much smaller. There isn't the realism that we're going to have in the High Renaissance. The viewer knew that the most important thing was up here. This was just the stage setting. And now we go to Cimabue. Cimabue was Giotto's teacher. People tend to know about Giotto, but they don't know as much about Cimabue. what we see over here is now the angels are starting to have their own physical space. One is in front of the other. We can start to sense that there's something underneath the cloth. But still, although it might look like there's something very solid here, when we get to Masaccio, you're going to see the difference. You'll see how flat this is in comparison. We do see, though, that the throne it's more solid. The perspective of the throne shows that a person could actually be sitting in it. And then we get to Giotto. He is the first Renaissance artist to bring back the idea of light and shadow. We don't have a particular light source yet. We can't say that the light is coming this way or coming from the other direction. Basically, everybody's face is white in light, but then to recede, things get darker here. We can see that the neck recedes because of the shadow under the neck. Again, over here. We also see that the body is starting to fill out more with Giotto. The expressions, especially in this next piece that we're going to look at, the Lamentation, the expressions are more human. We're stepping away from the divinity, or from the spiritual, I should say, and we're looking at more human expression, and we're starting to see poses that are very different. The earlier poses were either straight on or profile, but here if we look at the angels, so here I have them closer, we see them from different directions. So we're starting to have foreshortening. Foreshortening, I don't know if you're aware of the term, but what it means is things that come forward and things that recede in a painting. So for example, it's easy enough to draw a picture of my hand this way. However, if I put my hand this way, it's a much more difficult drawing to do. There's a famous painting by Mantegna of a reclining Christ, where his feet are at the front of the painting and his head is in the back. And that's another painting in foreshortening. That one was adjusted a little bit. Sorry I don't have it here. I just thought about it in the moment. But again, what we're seeing is the head further back and the feet forward in that one. Vasari spoke on Giotto. Mark, would you mind reading?
In my opinion, painters owe to Giotto exactly the same debt they owe to nature, which constantly serves them as a model, and whose finest and most beautiful aspects they are always striving to imitate and reproduce. For after many years, during which the methods and outlines of good painting had been buried under the ruins caused by war, it was Giotto alone who, by God's favor, rescued and restored the art, even though he was born among incompetent artists. It was indeed a great miracle that in so gross and incompetent an age, Giotto could be inspired to such good purpose that by his work he completely restored the art of design, of which his contemporaries knew little or nothing.
The way he was discovered, and this is legend, it's in Vasari's book, but people have said that Vasari's book, it's very romanticized in many ways, so we don't know how true this is. But Giotto, as a child, was seen by Cimabue drawing in a field. He was drawing goats or lambs. And he was drawing from life, and people didn't do that back then. The average great artist knew how to do portraits, and knew how to do feet, and knew how to do hands, and everything else was covered by clothing. But Giotto was drawing real nature, and that's how he was discovered, and that's how he was brought into Cimabue's studio, theoretically. We're going to go now to Masaccio. And if you look now, compared to what we were seeing before, this is almost like a marble statue. We see light coming from here. You can see real form. You know that there's a real human being under this clothing here. Jesus doesn't look strange anymore. Very often in the earlier Renaissance paintings, Jesus looks like a little man. He doesn't have the proportions that a baby has. A baby's proportions are like 3.5 heads to the body, where an idealized person, or a classically proportioned person, has 7.5 to 8 heads to the body. That means you measure 1, 2, 3, 4. So here we see Jesus not only with the proper proportions, but we can see the way light is coming out. We can see form coming around. We also see the two angels at the bottom are actually sitting on this marble ledge. We have two more angels here. One of them is actually even partially behind the throne. Again, that's another way of showing space, and it was quite creative at that time. If we look at the throne, it goes back in 1-point perspective. This is a real construction now. It's not well, it's a real construction now. Okay. We have the grapes over here. So again, we're not just seeing a baby being stuck in a painting, but now the baby is eating grapes, just like a child may do if the grapes were there. Or he could be crying. He's doing something that a child would be doing. In this case, it is eating grapes. This is a beautiful painting I love by Fra Angelico, and I'm showing it because, like the Masaccio, where we see the light coming from one direction, this is called the Madonna of the Shadows. Probably many of us have seen it. When you're at San Marco in Florence, which is the monastery that Fra Angelico lived in, when you go up the stairs to the second floor to see all of the monks' cells, this is at the top of the stairs. And it's about 20 feet away from a window. And it was painted so that the light coming from the window appears to be lighting the scene. So you'll see that the shadows are over here. And this was something that happened more and more often as the painters started to develop more. We're going to see it with the Holy Trinity by Masaccio as well in a moment. But we're going to do the tribute money first with Masaccio. This is a triptych. Triptych meaning 3 scenes. Oftentimes a triptych was painted as 3 separate paintings. We've often seen altarpieces that way. But here what we have is the tax collector coming to Jesus and demanding taxes. And Jesus is telling Peter, and very often you'll see Peter in this color with the beard. He's telling Peter to go to the Sea of Galilee, and the coin will be in the fish's mouth. Peter was a fisherman, very used to killing a fish, but in this case is gently taking the coin from the mouth. And then in the 3rd scene, we see him paying the tax collector. We can see it's the same person. Everybody else is in, I think it's called a tunic, but the tax collector, his scene is different. We're also starting to see more mature poses at this time. Contrapposto is a term that's used, contra going against the pose. So in classical sculpture, this would be considered contrapposto. The upper torso is going in a different direction than the lower torso. And that shows weight. It's not stiff anymore. It's natural to stand with your weight on one leg, which is what's happening over here. We also see, again, creativity with the posture. The tax collector is basically in the exact mirror pose is St. Peter. His arm is extended here, Peter's arm is extended here, Peter's hand is coming out this way, the tax collector's hand is coming out this way. And we see the same thing over here. Peter's right arm is extended, tax collector's right arm is extended. Peter's left arm we don't see, but it's probably doing something very similar. If you've been to the Brancacci Chapel, this is, the bottom of the painting is about this high. So you're looking up at the painting. And what you're going to see here, these paintings, to allow them to look more natural, the perspective that the viewer would really see it at, that's where it's painted from. So we're looking up into the arches because the painting was above us. We're seeing the bottom of the tax collector's foot because that was above our eyes. And one thing that we didn't see before, even with Giotto, is cast shadow. We saw form shadow, which is light and shadow coming around, but cast shadow is the shadow that is cast from the light that gets blocked by the object and is cast onto the ground or onto a table. This is, well, you don't see it, but the cast shadow, what that does is it allows the figures to appear firmly rooted in the ground. He was also the first painter to use one-point perspective. And we will see how that goes into the High Renaissance. I have a couple of images from the High Renaissance at the very end to show with that. But to allow the viewer's eye to go right to Jesus, we see the vanishing point is right in Jesus' left eye. All of the figures, and you'll notice this is true of any drawing in perspective, even if the figure is very close up, his head is going to line up there. It's just that his feet will come down much more. As things get smaller, then people will appear smaller. But we see the ledges, everything, the perspective brings us the bottom of the piece of architecture, everything goes right to Jesus' eye. And that's how linear perspective works. He was a friend of Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi, you may know, designed the dome in the Duomo in Florence. For I think it was 60 years, the church didn't have a dome. The architect who designed it died before he was able to tell people how the dome was actually going to be built. We don't even know if he knew how it was going to be built. But Brunelleschi, after he lost his famous competition with Ghiberti for the golden doors, the doors to heaven, he and Donatello went to Rome, I think it was 10 years, and he studied ancient Roman architecture. He studied the Pantheon and the big dome there. So then he was the one that figured out how to design the Duomo. Well, he learned one-point perspective, and he was not Masaccio's teacher, but they were friends. Florence is small, and he taught Masaccio about one-point perspective. So this is the birth of one-point perspective. Giotto, I'm just going to quickly show him. We don't see any perspective in Giotto. Everything is flat. The only reason that we know the hill is further back is because it's physically behind people. And here's where we go to basically the star of the whole show. This is the Holy Trinity. And we have Vasari on the Holy Trinity. William, would you like to?
I don't have my glasses.
No? Okay, well I will. Okay, so below the choir in Santa Maria Novella, Masaccio painted a fresco showing the Trinity, which is over the altar of St. Ignatius. And by the way, the altar isn't there anymore. It has Our Lady on one side and St. John the Evangelist on the other side. Our Lady and St. John the Evangelist, contemplating the crucified Christ. At the sides are the two kneeling figures. which as far as one can tell are portraits of those who commissioned the work. That would be these two here. Although they can scarcely be made out, as they have been covered over with gold ornamentation. So this fresco has deteriorated, so whatever gold there was doesn't exist anymore. But the most beautiful thing, apart from the figures, is the barrel-vaulted ceiling drawn in perspective and divided into square compartments containing rosettes, foreshortened and made to recede so skillfully that the surface looks as if it is indented. If you go there today, because of the deterioration of the painting, the power of the piece doesn't exist anymore, but apparently in its day, the perspective, this perfect one-point perspective, actually made it look like this was a hallway in the church that you could actually walk into and go behind Jesus. Now it's called the Holy Trinity, the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. The Father is obvious, it's God. He's holding Jesus' crucifix, and the Son is obvious. But does anybody know where the Holy Spirit is? I don't know if anybody's familiar with the painting. Yes, right. So this is not a collar. From far away, it looks like that's a collar, but that's a dove. I think I don't know if I have a close-up of that, but yes, that's a dove. So that's the Holy Spirit, because I think it was in the Bible that it was said that the Holy Spirit came as a dove. Do you know, Claire?
I think so.
Bible study?
I think that's what it says
yes,
in the Bible. Don't you? Is that the dove right on?
This is the dove. It's
Yes,
around God's neck.
Okay.
So he also shows God defying physical laws, because he's standing on this ledge, but his hands are holding the crucifix out, which is much too far away for his hands to actually be doing it. We talked about Renaissance theater before, and I did want to bring it up with these two. If anybody's seen Japanese no drama, there's a certain similarity. The actors that are passive in Japanese no drama are sitting on the stage with the musicians. And the actors that are active are acting. Renaissance theater did the same thing. So again, the average person knew how to read the painting. They knew that these people were part of the scene, and that's the way the Renaissance theater would do it. They would have the more passive actors on the stage, sitting passively or kneeling as they were waiting to go back on to the stage. Just want to quickly show the perspective that we're talking about. This is the eye level of the average person who will be going to Santa Maria Novella. So your eyes are here, that's the vanishing point. So if you can imagine having like a movie camera, and if you shoot out this way, then the vanishing point is at your eye level, at the eye level of the camera. So everything goes down to the vanishing point, which is why we have realistic perspective. The last thing I want to do is go to this skeleton. And this is not from the Bible. It's written in Italian from folklore, apparently. But it says, "As you are, I once was. As I am, you will become." Before I end, I have an 8-minute video that describes this much better than I can, and I just wanted to show that next.
Masacci's theories of perspective and apply them with astonishing effect was Masaccio. On a wall in a church in Florence, Masaccio created a three-dimensional illusion unlike any the world had ever seen. This extraordinary work, called the Trinity, finished about 1427, was the first known painting to demonstrate true linear perspective. For the people of Masaccio's day, it was as if the artist had dissolved the wall and created a new room. Yet, it was still a painting, just an illusion. Utilizing the power of the computer and digital technology, we can explore this imaginary space. Masaccio used perspective to create a space so consistent that we can actually enter the room. The computer even lets us rotate the room to look at the coffered inside of the vault from directly below. The images of Christ and the other figures become flat without sufficient visual information to create fully three-dimensional forms. Assuming that the coffers are square, the room itself becomes a rectangle, as we can see when we look at it from above. We can also view the room from the side. The black patches represent the parts of the ceiling that are covered by the architectural capitals that Masaccio painted in the foreground. The powerful effect of this illusion, painted by a young artist only in his 20s, is astonishing. Scaffolding erected for restoration of the Trinity provides us with the opportunity to examine the fresco at close range. The cleaning of the painting now completed, conservators fill in missing areas of the fresco with water-soluble paint, which can be removed at any time. Masaccio's original work is never touched. Strong raking lights help to highlight the surface of the plaster, enabling us to explore details not visible from the floor of the church below, and revealing Masaccio's technique. His use of perspective and geometry is extraordinary. All elements of the architecture grow out of his perspective design. Masaccio constructed the curves of the vaulted ceiling by stretching a length of string from a nail set in the wall and using a stylus to score the arcs into the wet plaster. He also incised lines to determine the perspective scheme for the work. This line, still visible, leads from the vanishing point below. To create straight lines such as these, Masaccio snapped a tautly stretched string into the wet plaster. You can still see the twisted texture of the string, preserved in the plaster for nearly 600 years. Masaccio made holes to mark the triangular corners of the pyramids painted on the inner surface of the arch. He also used a geometrical instrument to construct the rondels near the top of the composition. Incised lines define their outer rims and the edges of the fluting contained within. Masaccio created a network of large squares as a guide to painting the body of the Virgin. A grid of smaller squares was used for the drawing of her head, a challenge in foreshortening. They can still be seen. Each day he worked on the Trinity, Masaccio would cover a small portion of the wall with wet plaster, only as much as he could finish painting before the plaster dried. Close up, we can see the overlapping borders between these patches, which are called giornate, after the Italian word for day. There are 28 giornate, indicating that it took at least 28 separate days to complete the composition. The donor on the left was painted on day 24. This line indicates the work below, painted on day 25. Restorers have developed a detailed diagram showing the sequence in which the giornate were painted. The missing areas around the edges and the gaps within the composition represent the parts of the original fresco that no longer exist. Using the diagram as a guide and the magic of the computer, we can recreate the order in which Masaccio painted this masterpiece. The Trinity marks the beginning of a visual revolution, a turning point in the history of art. The first painter to fully utilize the power of perspective, Masaccio set the standard for others to follow. Linear perspective opened up a new world for the artists of the Renaissance, and they excitedly explored its vast potential.
So this is what I meant by coming to the doorway of the High Renaissance. In this church, if you've ever been there, behind the altar, it might be 12 or 16, there are large frescoes by Ghirlandaio's studio. He was the main studio artist of the time. He was, he was like the big superstar at the time, and he hired Michelangelo as a child. Michelangelo, usually the apprentice would have to pay to study, but he saw Michelangelo was so good, and Michelangelo's father, a very proud man because his family used to be wealthy and had lost it, he didn't want his son to be a craftsman working with his hands, so Ghirlandaio had to pay Michelangelo to work. Anyway, Michelangelo worked with him on those frescoes, and he saw every day, he would see the tribute money, and apparently he was very, very inspired by it. Looking at one point perspective again, this is our Last Supper, and when I say that Masaccio brought us to the doorway of the High Renaissance, again, now we have one point perspective here. Leonardo did this other very famous piece, which is done in one point perspective. Sadly, Leonardo had one mechanical issue of never finishing or rarely finishing what he set out to do. And I don't remember the exact quote, but basically he said, the discovery of how to solve the problem was the higher right, not actually completing the piece. So a lot of pieces that Leonardo had started, he never finished. But this is a perfect example, not only of one-point perspective, but all of these lines and all of these lines on the sketch show exactly how objects were placed, how far back things go, how much smaller they get as they go further back. And I had one more reading. I felt this was very interesting because we're studying realism here. So this is a fictitious eyewitness's report. Somebody who stated that they had actually seen Jesus. So the picture that we have of Jesus is because at this time, the forged eyewitness from the fictitious Lentulus, governor of Judea, to the Roman Senate. And he describes Jesus as a man of average to moderate height and very distinguished. He has an impressive appearance, so those who look on him love and fear him. His hair is of the color of a ripe hazelnut. It falls straight almost to the level of his ears. From there down it curls thickly and is rather more luxuriant. And this hangs down to his shoulders. In front, his hair is parted into two, with the parting in the center, in the Nazarene manner. His forehead is wide, smooth, and serene, and his face is without wrinkles or any marks. It is graced by a slight reddish tinge, a faint color. His nose and mouth are faultless. His beard is thick, and like a young man's first beard, as the same color as his hair. It is not particularly long and parted in the middle. His aspect is simple and mature. His eyes are brilliant, mobile, clear, and splendid. He is terrible when he reprehends, quiet and kindly when he admonishes. He is quick in his movements, but always keeps his dignity. No one ever saw him laugh, but he has been seen to weep. He is broad in the chest and upstanding. His hands and arms are fine. In speech, he is serious, sparing, and modest. He is the most beautiful among the children of men. And I'm just, I need to advertise. So I just graduated, and I'm putting together books for children on this type of a topic. The first one I just finished, it's with the editor now, is The Life of Michelangelo, as told to children from Lorenzo de' Medici, which is why you see Lorenzo de' Medici here. Because he was the person who brought so much of this to Florence. And then the second book, which I'm writing now, is again Lorenzo de' Medici and a child's journey into the life of Leonardo da Vinci. So, well, that's the presentation. If anybody has questions or thoughts. Robert?
Anthony, this, it's interesting, the technique of the giornati, the painting fresco. Is that what all fresco painters did?
You
The
have
Sistine
to.
Chapel?
Yes, and the reason being, the way to create a fresco is first you had to actually, with a hammer, break the wall. It couldn't be done on a smooth wall. And then one of your apprentices would apply the wet plaster. Fresco means fresh in Italian. And then you would put the drawing on the, let me go to Giotto, because that shows it the best. Okay, then you would put the cartoon, it's called, a line drawing, on the wet plaster, and the master had to work very fast. Once the drawing was down, the master had to paint in this water-based paint before the fresh plaster dried. So one apprentice would be spraying with water, and the master would be painting. People say that Michelangelo worked alone. It's hard to imagine that that would be the case. But they could only work on the amount of space that they could work on while the plaster stayed dry, which is why you see all of these fissures. Al secco means dry. So some masters would continue on later when it was dried, when the plaster was dried. That's the stuff that was the most easy to fall away, because it's not like a tattoo inside the wall. It's on top of the wall. And when moisture comes or whatever else it may be, or over the centuries, plaster would separate from that paint. Any other questions? Yes.
So then the Last Supper, was the wall not broken in? Is that
The-
why it started healing right
No,
away?
the thing with the Last Supper, Leonardo was a great experimenter. He didn't do a fresco, he did an oil painting on a wall. And in his lifetime, and my understanding is actually as he was finishing the painting, the earlier parts were already starting to separate from the wall. So one of his, the issues that he had was that he was experimenting so much, and a couple of times he lost paintings. The Last Supper fragmented like that, and then you may know about the big competition between Leonardo and Michelangelo. I think it was at Palazzo Vecchio, where they were both hired to paint large frescoes. The Battle of Anghiari, I think it's pronounced, was the one that Leonardo did. Michelangelo, it was the battle, I forget what mythical creatures come to a party and steal away the women. It starts with a C. But,
Syndrome.
okay, yes, okay, right. So anyway, Leonardo was working in oil, and he had to heat the painting so it would dry properly. So he had devised this big scaffold where fire would be near the painting and dry the painting precisely the way it needed to be dried, but one way or another they lost control of the fire and the whole painting melted, which is why that never happened. And then Michelangelo, his life was controlled by the popes, and I don't remember which pope it would have been, but they would have, maybe that's when he was told to get back to Julius's tomb or to get onto the Sistine Chapel. So neither painting exists, but we have cartoons of both. Yes.
Can you explain the vanishing point a little more?
Yes. Okay. Again, like I said, imagine you have a camera, okay, and you're shooting the ocean. The vanishing point is along the horizon line in the ocean when we see the sky meet, but it's the place that you're looking. So there's my vanishing point, and over here, now it's over here. And all of the lines in the painting, and it's not created by the artist, this is real science. All architecture, the tabletop, everything, if this was a picture, would be seen to go toward the vanishing point. The reason that I can see the tabletop is because I'm above. So looking at the horizon line, anything that is below the horizon line, you would see the top of. But if I came down here, if I was shooting in Hollywood, and for some reason I was shooting down here, then this is my vanishing point, and I can't see the top of the table anymore, but I can see, obviously, the top of the bottom of the ceiling. So it's where your eyes are and what you're focused on. Thank you very much.
And then
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.